Welcome back to Storytime for Grown-Ups. This evening I will be discussing the various short stories of Poe that I've read over the past few days, as well as a little bit of a discussion on Gothic literature. So according to the City University of New York's page on Gothic literature, the English Gothic novel began with Horace Walpole's The Castle of Otranto, written in 1765. American Gothic followed English Gothic, and both are an offshoot of Big R Romantic literature. Romantic literature focuses on the sublime and the natural world, and the ties of the natural world to mankind and to the ethereal. Gothic literature narrows in on the destructive forces of nature, such as those found in storms or decay or erosion, and their ties to the darker aspects of human nature. Additionally, Gothic lit extends romantic discussion of the natural to man-made things that act to create the habitat of mankind, such as imbuing ruined or ancient buildings with a sinister or melancholy air. The Gothic use of the ethereal also tends toward its darker aspects, curses, ghosts, demons, etc., and does make use of the natural to convey aspects of the supernatural. For example, when a storm is happening, you hear a moaning, and it might be the wind or it might be spirits. There's a crash of lightning that might also be the slamming open of a door or the breaking of a mirror. Gothic events, or threats thereof, tend to be horrific or terrifying, the former being a horror that is described, and the latter being a horror that is left, at least somewhat, to speculation and imagination. Poe was considered America's first great literary critic, as per the Edgar Allan Poe Museum online. His primary concern in the writing and critiquing of stories was a unity of effect, that every element of the story helped to create a single emotional impact. He used Gothic stylings to great effect in this endeavor, creating thrilling and unique tales of horror and intrigue. So in American Gothic literature, Poe is specifically known for prioritizing character psychology over location creepiness to create horror. For example, in Berenice, none of the terror is born from setting. Our first touch of fear comes from the main character's disconnect with time and society, and the mirroring of this disconnect within his own mind. Our narrator would probably get a modern-day diagnosis of obsessive-compulsive disorder. He obsesses on mundane things, focusing on the thing itself and ruminating continuously, and then feeling a strong compulsion to act a certain way with regard to the object of his obsession, to the point where it impinges on his everyday life. Now, some people with obsessive-compulsive disorder do have violent obsessions or compulsions. Few, if any, ever follow through on them, because, like most mental disorders, violence is a very rare effect of obsessive-compulsive disorder. But these are incredibly painful obsessions to have, because it's incredibly guilt-inducing to consider something like ripping the teeth from the person you love. It is interesting that the narrator is mad and sickly. It's important to note that these go hand in hand in most of Poe's works, because as our point of view is tied to his, the horror of the tale comes not from the things the madman has wrought, as it would had any other character been narrator, but instead from the effects that the madness has had. The main reason that this strikes me as the horror of the tale is that the actual act is unseen. There is a loss of time, and then a retroactive understanding of what it is that the body has done without input from the conscious mind. There was no will, no impetus to the action that was taken. It is remembered but not planned, recalled but not attended to in the time of doing. It is something his ill mind did to him, rather than a thing that he has done. Now, obviously, the ripping out of teeth, the desecration of a body, worse, the burying alive of a woman, and the unburying only to re-victimize her by removing her teeth and thus ending her life torturously after her having awakened been buried alive, is all horrific. But the acts are not the focus of the terror. Berenice reads to me of the very true fear of following through with a disturbing and inescapable obsession. While, as evidenced, Poe could and did create horror without a focus on setting, he did make very good use of the Gothic structure, though with him the building was often not the impetus for the horror, but instead an extension of the horror in the minds of its inhabitants. The Fall of the House of Usher is an excellent example of this technique. Overall, the tenor of the story is one of terror. You don't quite know what's happening. The narrator is likewise unaware, but there is a buildup of something. And that something does eventually culminate in a horrific event, but the main emotion that I experienced, reading alone in the night, was terror. You begin with this Gothic house, a house described as having its own timbre, almost its own soul. There's a sense of offness, of wrongness in the setup of the whole estate. The narrator attempts to make sense of what creates this dis-ease, going so far as to look at the scene in reflection, but this serves only to increase the uneasiness that it brings him. The House of Usher is a house that is crumbling and eccentric, covered in fungi, surrounded by stagnant water, a house imbued with the soul of the macabre. And this house is said to stand in a tangible way for the Usher family, of which there exists but one hereditary line, which is described as cursed. So we begin, and this description of the house sets the tone for our tale. Usher himself is ill, of body and mind. Again, we see that tendency to create visible, palpable evidence for mental disturbance. So far we have lots of Gothic tropes. A house in seclusion, a person in seclusion, a house as the extension of the people within it, an ancestral curse upon both people and manor, an illness of body and an illness of mind. Now the madness of Usher is made very apparent. Poe even includes a poem written by Usher to inspire in the reader the terror and discordancy that is predominant in his mind. And yet, this time, as differs from Berenice, it is not the madness that causes the horror, but the confusion of true experience with madness. There is a distrust in Usher's ties to reality, from us, the readers, from the narrator, and also from Usher himself. It was, in fact, when Usher appeared least sane, that he was at his most lucid. His attention to presumed silence was in actuality his attending to his entombed sister's cries for help, her pounding and clawing at the door to her prison. In knowing his own madness, Usher gave no credence to these events, and so sealed his own and her fate. Now this all, of course, culminates in the storm, this very Gothic night, when the spirit of the house is very much present, and Poe uses the tale within a tale device to great effect. We have this big R romantic story being read about the conquering of the beast by man, tied in grotesque reflection to the Gothic narrative of our story. The moments of triumph in the storybook mirror the moments of horror in the narrative. The screams of the dying dragon are the screams of the entombed woman. The clang of the shield at the hero's feet is the clanging open of the door of the tomb. And then, of course, the Lady Usher enters the room, finally succumbing to death, and the shock of these events kills the frail Usher. Our narrator flees, as one might do, and, in perhaps the Gothic moment of the work, the house itself falls. The house, this external tie to the internal that was the line of Usher, falls with the fall of the end of the line, taken over by the stagnant water as though it never existed, as the family will disappear from time, its line extinguished, as all disappears from time. Now Ligeia evoked an entirely different sensation than the two already spoken of. Rather than terror or horror, it seems to call forth a thrill of disturbed tragedy. The tragedy stems, of course, from the main plot. The perfect woman, beautiful, loving, brilliant, strong of will and strong of mind, dies, and the man is broken by his loss, drops into grief, sequesters himself physically in his abbey and mentally in the opium dreams from the outside world. This separation from society in a house that he bedecks strangely to mimic the interior of his mind is extremely Gothic. He remarries a woman he does not love and who loves him not, who serves as less than a placeholder for his true wife. And even in her death, he thinks only of the one he lost. Even sitting vigil at her deathbed, he thinks only of Ligeia, as he has done their whole marriage, in a room where the images of ghostly apparition flit across the curtains as she flits across his mind. This rumination acts as almost a conduit to the reincarnation of his lost love, which is, of course, the horrifying ending. The granting of his wish in a terrifying way. The rumination seeming to work supernaturally to transform his new wife physically into the old. There is a sense of horrified sorrow for the woman whose life is not only lost, but erased, in a way that mirrors quite brilliantly the fact that, after having died, should all have been natural, her husband, the one who is meant to mourn her most strongly, would have thought and spoken of her never. This is the tragedy, with a twist of horror. And yet, there is a more disturbing tale in this work, that of Ligeia, the perfect woman. Perfect in a way that is actually impossible, beautiful in a way that is indescribable, brilliant beyond measure, more knowledgeable than any person that our narrator has ever met. She loves more purely than he is worthy of, and on this point he and I are in full agreement. He's not worthy. With a will of impossible strength, which is mentioned time and again. And then we have two things. One is the repetition of the initial quote, which involves basically the fact that the loss of will is what allows mankind to perish. Not a weakness necessarily of will, but the fact that the will of man is less than the will of God. Second is the use of poem within the story, a poem written by Ligeia, which speaks of the inevitability and the horror of death. These two items taken together speak of inevitability of the failure of man's will against God, the rightness of such an order as proclaimed by the angels. And yet, she returns from the grave. In addition to the terror of the raising of the dead, there is a retroactive horror, the impossibility of Ligeia at the outset. Her perfection is made manifestly horrific by the fact that she is capable of willing herself to being through the death of another. And the questions that create the terror, that make a disturbed tragedy rather than just a sorrowful one, still remain. Has she done this before? Was she ever human? How many times has she denied the final words of the angels in her written poem? And how many will she do it again? Lastly, there's the Masque of the Red Death, yet another distinct approach to the disturbing. This, of all the Poe stories I've read, is the Gothic work which acts most interestingly with regards to its romantic roots. Rather than the natural highlighting the emotionality or purpose of the story, the natural is itself the horror of the story, pestilence, or, more to the point, death. While these other stories are grotesque and terrifying, they play on more supernatural or unusual terrors. The Masque of the Red Death is about mortality, which is very, very real. Now in it, this group of people sequesters themselves away from a dying populace, secure and reveling, literally reveling, throwing a masquerade joyously and gaily frittering about in the time that they have, sure that there is time yet to fritter. There are a lot of socio-political points that can be made by the use of this. In modern times, we have the reactions of politicians to the AIDS crisis in the 1980s. We have the way in which the wealthy do now and have always continued to live their life spending money that they have and that they've earned that could be going towards helping the poor. We have countries, whole countries of people who predominantly have food to eat and a place to sleep, and countries where most of the populace is starving or homeless. I'm not certain if Poe was making any of these points, but all of these can be pulled from this story. And it is definitely true that while Poe writes of their revelry, he also takes care to create a feeling of unease for the reader. In the setup of the suites of the masquerade, one room cannot see into the next. In the light that plays through colored windows into colored rooms, creating an unreal and an eerie feeling, and of course, in the room, at the far end, that is itself shrouded in the colors of death. And it is in this room that the clock ticks away the time that these revelers refuse to acknowledge until it makes itself known in loud, inescapable chimes. While the partygoers respond with unease to the clock, it is anger which they first display toward the reminder of the dead and dying that their intruder brings. Anger that they have to be bothered with the suffering of others, and it is only as he nears them that this anger turns to fear, and they attempt to remove themselves from the attention of the specter of all that they have been inattentive to. But it is too late, and they all fall victim to the scourge that they locked themselves up to avoid. There's a dramatic irony there, and, alone in the works I've discussed, a sense of justice in the ending. Poe's works succeed brilliantly at his goal. Each short story very much works toward a single and virulent emotional impact. Poe believed that the short story was a better medium than the novel, stating, quote, "As a novel cannot be read in one sitting, it deprives itself, of course, of the immense force derivable from totality." Now, this makes some amount of sense if you prioritize unity of effect. Novels often attempt to have varying emotional impacts, not a singular one, and additionally the stopping and starting does serve to lessen the immediate emotionality of the medium. However, I disagree with this assessment, because allowing time to separate moments of reading can allow for a more in-depth analysis of work on a cerebral level. While life can distract from the impact of reading, it can also add depth to the reading, both by allowing events in fiction to connect with those in reality, and by spending time day to day in speculation and consideration of the story as a whole. This has been very true for me with this channel, where reading things piecemeal and allowing time between the reading and the discussion has opened up the ability to make connections within the work, and to have a more emotional connection to the novels, poems, and short stories herein. I think fans of stories in any type of media can attest to the strengthening of emotional impact by allowing ourselves to ruminate on them over time. We create a single emotional connection with a piece of media based on an innumerable amount of emotional moments and nuances, tying that media to ourselves and our lives and other media that we've encountered. So while I do appreciate Poe's concern, and I tip my hat to his mastery of his variety of storytelling. I do believe also that there is a lot of good in the experience of literature that one would miss out on by applying his idea too generally. I hope that you've enjoyed this discussion of Poe, and the next project that I have in mind is a reading of Paradise Lost. So I hope you tune in. Happy Halloween.